Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. We are tracing the most profound idea in human history, the concept of God. We'll explore how this idea evolved from ancient hunter-gatherer totems to universal faiths, dive into the fierce debates between religion and atheism, featuring heavyweights like Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche, and uncover how ancient rituals still hide in our modern habits.
It really is just a massive journey. I mean, we are going from the absolute earliest human settlements,
Right.
mapping the evolution of our deepest beliefs, and ending up right in the middle of a modern sports stadium.
I honestly cannot wait to get into this. And hey, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. So to guide us on this deep dive today, we are relying on two incredibly detailed grounding texts.
Yes, we have Mystery of Religions by Birant Esenolu and Culture and Religion by Yumni Sezin.
Exactly. And our mission here is to unpack the sociological and philosophical origins of the concept of God. But beyond that, we want to impartially examine the intense intellectual clash between religious thought and the atheistic or materialist critiques that kind of try to tear it down.
Yeah, and before we go any further, I need to make something very clear to you, the listener. The sources we're exploring today contain incredibly strong, often polarizing views on religion, atheism, Marxism, and materialism.
Definitely.
As your guides, we are completely impartial. We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing any specific viewpoint, whether it's highly religious or strictly atheistic. Our only goal today is to act as your analytical lenses, just helping you understand the complex arguments presented in these texts exactly as the authors laid them out.
Absolutely. Okay, let's unpack this. Esenolu's theory in Mystery of Religions starts with a premise that really caught me off guard. He argues that the concept of God didn't start as a singular omnipotent being looking down from the clouds. He says it evolved right alongside human economics, which is, I mean, how does an economy create a God?
Well, we have to look at the timeline of human survival. If we go back to the absolute earliest stages of human history, what earlier academics sometimes called the lower stages of savagery and early barbarism.
Which are loaded terms, obviously.
Very loaded. But in simple English, we're talking about the era when humans were purely nomadic. They were egalitarian hunter-gatherers. They were just, trying to survive the winter.
Right. Nobody's hoarding wealth because there is literally no wealth to hoard. You catch a mammoth, everybody eats.
Exactly. And in these early communal societies, there was no concept of a distant ruler like God. Instead, there was a shared collective spirit, usually represented by a totem.
A totem?
Yeah, and here's the key thing. The totem wasn't a deity you bowed down and prayed to. It was more like a mascot, a representation of the community's own shared life force. The people, the animals, the rivers, they were all seen as one continuous horizontal entity.
So in those early days, what actually changes? How do we get from a shared nature spirit to a big guy in the sky?
Humanity enters a phase where they finally figure out animal domestication and herding. Basically, they learn how to build fences and keep sheep. And suddenly, for the very first time in human history, there's a surplus of goods.
Wow. Okay.
You don't just have enough food for today, you have wealth for tomorrow. And with surplus comes the invention of private property, the division of social classes, and a massive shift to male dominance. Patriarchy.
The egalitarian commune is completely shattered.
Utterly shattered.
So a few guys suddenly own all the herds, and they realize they need a way to stop everyone else from just taking their stuff.
Precisely. When a small elite holds the power and the property, they need a mechanism to protect those new social privileges. This is the birth of the taboo and the sacred.
Wait, so the sacred was invented to protect property?
According to this sociological view, yes. These concepts weren't just spontaneous spiritual awakenings. They were highly effective ideological tools. The sacred was essentially invented as an invisible boundary line. It was a way of saying, you cannot touch this land or these animals because a higher power forbids it.
Wow. So as society on the ground became more hierarchical, the spiritual world had to mirror that.
That is the core argument. The spirits that once walked the earth horizontally alongside humans were suddenly elevated. They became untouchable, sky-dwelling male gods, perfectly reflecting the new male-dominated hierarchical society on the ground.
That makes me think about the actual rituals. Like, did the way people worship change when the economy changed? I know there's a huge discussion in our sources about the shift from human sacrifice to animal sacrifice.
It's a profound example of what we call sociological determinism. During the earlier, desperate eras of hunting and gathering, society lived in constant, paralyzing fear of famine. Because they were so desperate, human sacrifice was practiced out of sheer survival terror.
Just trying to appease the uncontrollable forces of nature.
Exactly. It was the ultimate tragic offering.
But once they figure out how to domesticate animals, they have a reliable food source.
Yeah.
They aren't starving anymore.
And right on cue, the religious divine command shifts. The classic example provided is the story of Abraham and the ram. Just as Abraham is about to sacrifice his son, God stops him and provides a ram instead.
Right.
Analytically speaking, this isn't just a spiritual test. It represents the exact historical moment when human society realized it no longer needed to sacrifice its own children. They had sheep now. The religion adapted to the new economic abundance.
That perfectly sets up this mind-bending quote from the sources regarding ancient Sumerian creation myths. The traditional myth claims that the gods created humans.
Right.
But the sociological truth we're uncovering here is the exact opposite. Humans created gods in their own image. They designed the heavens to justify their own societal structures, their own kings, and their own economies.
And if we realize that ancient societies literally invented the divine to mirror their new economies, it makes total sense why later philosophers looked back at this and completely dismantled the idea of God. Which brings us to the massive intellectual clashes of the modern era.
Yes, let's dive into the heavyweights. We have to start with the Marxist view. Karl Marx is famous for calling religion the opium of the masses. But what does that actually mean in this context?
Marx approached religion through a framework called historical materialism. Basically, this is the idea that the material conditions of our world, who owns the factories, who does the labor, who has the money, dictate everything else, including our culture and our beliefs.
Okay.
For Marx, religion is viewed purely as an artificial coping mechanism.
So it's not an inherently evil thing in his eyes, but more of a painkiller.
Exactly. The full quote is often forgotten. He called it the opium of the masses, but also the heart of a heartless world. From this atheistic perspective, the ruling classes oppress the working classes in a harsh, unfeeling capitalist reality. The workers are miserable.
So they need an escape.
Right. Religion is created by and for these oppressed classes to help them survive the pain. It acts as an ideological painkiller. It keeps the masses docile because it convinces them that if they just suffer quietly now, they will get an eternal reward in the afterlife.
Why revolt against your terrible boss today if God is going to give you a mansion in heaven tomorrow?
Exactly.
That is a brutal critique of how religion functions economically. But the critique doesn't stop there. We also dive deep into the psychological critiques, which are honestly even more intense. Where does Sigmund Freud fit into all of this?
Freud takes the economic critique and turns it inward. He viewed religion as a literal collective neurosis, a mental illness on a societal scale. To explain this, Freud developed the theory of the primal horde, which is sometimes called the father-murder complex.
The father-murder complex.
Yeah. He posited an ancient mythological scenario where a group of brothers banded together to overthrow and kill their tyrannical, all-powerful father who hoarded all the resources.
Wait, so they kill the father, but then what? Do they just take over?
They take over, but they are immediately overwhelmed by a crushing, paralyzing guilt. According to Freud, to deal with this massive collective trauma, humanity elevated the memory of this murdered father into a totem and eventually into an all-seeing God.
So for Freud, religion is essentially a psychological safety blanket.
Precisely. Humanity has this deep, childlike terror of the vast, cold universe. We don't want to grow up and face the dark alone, so we invent a protective, cosmic father figure to soothe our collective anxiety.
So Marx says it's an economic painkiller, Freud says it's a psychological safety blanket, and then Friedrich Nietzsche walks in and basically sets the whole room on fire.
He took a sledgehammer to it. Nietzsche took perhaps the most aggressive stance of all. He argued that religion wasn't just a coping mechanism, it was a profound mental illness born from repressed human instincts.
How so?
Well, Nietzsche believed that human beings naturally have a will to power, a drive to be strong, dominant, and excellent. But religion, specifically what he called slave morality, flipped the script.
By making weakness look like a virtue.
Exactly. Nietzsche argued that clever, manipulative priests realized they couldn't win by physical strength, so they invented concepts like sin and humility.
I see.
They convinced the strong that their strength was evil and convinced the weak that their suffering made them holy. Religion, to Nietzsche, was a tool of ultimate psychological manipulation used by the weak to chain down the strong.
Although there is a rather dark, tragic irony here that's hard to ignore. Nietzsche, who aggressively called religion a disease of the weak and constantly praised the ultimate, perfectly rational Superman, ended his own life suffering from a severe mental breakdown in an asylum.
It is a stark historical footnote, certainly, but his philosophical wrecking ball paved the way for modern atheist critiques. Thinkers like Turan Dursun took these foundational arguments and applied them aggressively to ancient religious rituals.
Like the sacrifices we talked about.
Yes, Dursun looked at things like animal sacrifice or complex purity laws and evaluated them using strict modern logic. He argued that by today's logical and moral standards, these practices are primitive, nonsensical, and entirely absurd.
He's basically asking why modern people in the 21st century are still adhering to rituals born thousands of years ago in entirely different social contexts.
Exactly.
It is a heavy, heavy barrage of criticism, economics, psychology, philosophy. They attack the concept of God from every angle.
Yeah.
But, every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
Uh-huh.
Our sources do not let materialism and atheism off the hook.
No, they don't.
Let's weigh the counter-arguments because they hit back hard.
They do indeed. Yumni Sezin provides a very robust foundational philosophical counter-argument against materialism itself. Materialism claims that physical matter is all there is, and that this matter, the universe, the atoms, is eternal. It has just always been here.
Okay.
Sezin argues this fundamentally defies basic logic.
Break that down for me. Why does eternal matter defy logic?
Think about the nature of physical matter. Anything physical, by its very definition, is limited by dimensions. A table has height, width, and depth. A planet has a circumference. It is finite. Sezin argues that you cannot construct true, absolute infinity out of finite parts. No matter how many finite blocks you stack together, you never reach true infinity. Therefore, the material universe must have boundaries, a beginning and an end.
And if it has a beginning, something infinite, something utterly beyond matter, must exist to have initiated it.
Exactly. And Sezin also attacks the atheist idea of a universe born from pure coincidence, the idea that everything is just a random collision of atoms.
Because if the universe is purely a lucky accident of random chaotic atoms bumping into each other, then two major things collapse, right?
Yes. First, the concept of human freedom is an illusion. If we are just random chemical reactions, we have no free will. We are just biological robots reacting to stimuli. Second, even the scientific method itself becomes impossible.
Because science relies on predictable rules.
Mm-hmm.
If everything is random chaos, water might boil at 100 degrees today and freeze at 100 degrees tomorrow.
Exactly. Science relies on a deeply orderly, predictable universe. To illustrate this profound order, the text uses a beautifully specific example, the ozone layer.
Oh, this is a great point.
The ozone layer functions as a perfect, highly delicate braking system for the sun's deadly ultraviolet rays. If it were slightly thinner, life on land would burn up. If it didn't exist, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
It's like finding a perfectly calibrated thermostat in the middle of a barren desert. You don't assume the wind blew the sand into the shape of a thermostat.
Precisely. The sources argue that this kind of precise, life-sustaining mechanism implies a deliberate will and purpose, a creator, rather than a lucky mathematical accident.
That is a powerful counter to pure materialism. But what about the other side of the critique? What about Isinolu's defense against modern atheists like Turan Dursun, who called those ancient religious rituals primitive and absurd? How do you defend something that looks a bit crazy to a modern eye?
Isinolu argues that judging a 10,000-year-old ritual using 21st century morality is historically blind. When someone like Dursun mocks ancient sacrifice, he is completely ignoring the profound sociological determinism of that era.
Right, because they were surviving.
Exactly. Early religious myths and rules weren't just arbitrary absurdities or foolish superstitions that ignorant people made up for fun. They were exact, desperately necessary reflections of the survival economics of their time.
So when they shifted from sacrificing humans to sacrificing sheep, it wasn't just a quirky change in the rule book.
It was a massive evolutionary leap for humanity. It was dictated by the domestication of animals. It saved countless lives and stabilized early societies. To dismiss these ancient rituals as just primitive absurdities is to deeply misunderstand how human society survives, adapts, and evolves in the face of a terrifying natural world.
That brings us to a really fascinating question. If these concepts of God and ritual evolved to help tribes survive and explain their local economies, what happens when the world gets bigger? How does this ancient concept of God function today?
To understand that, Sezin makes a crucial distinction between closed religions and open or universal religions. Closed religions are entirely tribal and cultural. Think of ancient shamanism or early tribal faiths.
Where the God belongs only to one specific tribe.
Exactly. If you aren't born into the tribe, you don't worship that god. The religion is essentially the culture itself, and it has absolutely no desire to convert outsiders.
But open religions are the big ones we know today.
Yes, open religions like Islam and Christianity are universal. They claim to possess a fundamental truth that speaks to all of humanity, regardless of your tribe, your language, or your borders. And crucially, they actively seek to spread that message globally.
But here's where my mind was completely blown by the research. When a massive, universal religion sweeps into a new area and meets a local, closed culture, the old culture doesn't just pack up and vanish.
No, it adapts.
The text provides a brilliant example of this with the Turkish Islamic synthesis. When the universal God of Islam met the ancient shamanic culture of the Turks in Central Asia, they merged.
It is a beautiful example of sociological adaptation. The ancient Turkish shamans, the Kams, who were believed to fly through the air, heal the sick, and communicate directly with nature spirits, didn't disappear when Islam arrived. They just transformed.
They became Muslim dervishes and Sufi saints.
Exactly. The text highlights the famous historical figure of Haki Bektash-Veli, a revered Islamic mystic. In the local legends, he is described as turning into a pigeon and flying across the landscape.
Which is just a direct continuation of the ancient shamanic flight motif. It's the
Yeah.
exact same ancient magic, just wearing a new Islamic cloak.
Yes.
Even the physical landscape retained its ancient magic.
Yeah.
When you see people today lighting candles at a shrine or tying pieces of cloth to a wish tree while saying a prayer, you are literally watching an ancient animist ritual hiding in plain sight within a modern universal faith.
And this synthesis raises a vital question about the modern day. As secularism rises and traditional religious practice declines in many industrialized parts of the world, does that mean the fundamental human need for the sacred just evaporates?
According to the sociological analysis in our sources, absolutely not. Human beings still crave devotion. They crave ritual, and they desperately need a sense of belonging to something greater than themselves.
Which leads to the rise of what the text calls quasi-religions, or yivdin. Because the religious impulse is hardwired into our psychology, it doesn't disappear, it just gets redirected. And the examples the sources give are wild, but so accurate. People worshiping pop idols or soccer stars.
It sounds like an exaggeration at first to call a sports fandom a religion. But sociologically, it operates on the exact same hardware. Look at a modern soccer stadium.
You see fans painting their faces in tribal colors. They display fanatical, unquestioning devotion. They engage in complex, synchronized chanting rituals.
They weep when their team loses, and they even commit acts of intense tribal violence against rival fans.
It is exactly what ancient tribes did when defending their local gods. The object of worship has simply changed from a sky deity to a celebrity or a corporate sports logo, but the psychological and social mechanisms are completely identical.
Precisely. We haven't outgrown the sacred, we've just relocated it.
We really have.
So, bringing this all together for you, the listener, why should you care about this wild journey from ancient totems to philosophers to soccer hooligans? Because whether you consider yourself a devout, practicing believer, a strict materialist atheist, or somewhere completely in between, understanding these arguments gives you a superpower.
It helps you see the invisible architecture of human society.
It shows how our deepest, most fiercely held beliefs aren't just floating in a vacuum. They are intricately intertwined with our economic survival, our biological psychology, and the deep, invisible cultural currents we inherited from ancestors who lived thousands of years ago.
And that leaves us with a final thought to ponder, building on everything we've explored today. We have seen how our concept of God evolved from tribal totems that reflected small, egalitarian communities, to sky gods that reflected hierarchical farming empires, to universal gods that reflected global trade and interconnectedness. So we have to ask, what is our current hyper-connected digital economy creating right now? As traditional religion competes with modern quasi-religions of celebrity and technology, are we currently in the middle of inventing an entirely new type of sacred, perhaps worshiping the algorithm or artificial intelligence without even realizing we are doing it?
Now that is a profound question to leave you with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the origins and evolution of our most powerful ideas. Until next time, keep looking beneath the surface.